Hello, my name is Gwen Ragsdale.
And I'm J. Justin Ragsdale.
And we're curators of Lest We Forget the Black Holocaust Museum of African American Slavery. We're here to talk to you about our private collection of slavery artifacts and Jim Crow memorabilia. These items were intentionally created to denigrate blacks. This collection was started by my husband over 30-some years ago, and he started quite by accident when he was visiting his uncle when he was a young boy.
My uncle lived during slavery. He would tell me stories when we would go down and visit him in South Carolina on the back porch. He would talk with us and tell us these things of the horrors of slavery that no one knew about. I myself, being a young boy, was quite amazed at the stories. I was in awe, intrigued. I wanted to hear more. He in turn told me that when he died or passed on, him and his buddies had always said that these stories would never be told again. I decided as a young boy that whenever I got to age, I wanted to become something, to do something, to show people, to tell people. Going to school, I realized that there was a disconnect. This disconnect came from our lack of knowledge of the things that happened in the horrors of slavery. There is a disconnect. The disconnect is affecting our children today. Today we hold in our hands these shackles. It is our business and our quest, my wife and I, to tell the story, to make people understand the value of slavery so that we in turn, once they know what's going on, they in turn would help us to stop the violence.
So what you're about to see are items that were used during slavery. Items that were used primarily to restrain and punish Africans brought to America and enslaved for hundreds of years. These items truly brings history alive and make you realize that coming to America for Africans was very different than coming to America was for other groups who willingly immigrated to America. We want to share this information with you, not to shame one group or to anger another, but to make you realize the enduring spirit of the African American and the contribution that we have made to America, and recognize that together we will all make America stronger.
I want to take you on a journey, a terrifying journey, the likes of which you will never ever believe. Slavery in all its essence, in all its hatred, in all its terror. This is what we want to talk about. First thing in the morning, you as a native, a person who is minding your own business, hear gunfire, slavers coming to capture you, slavers coming to kill you, to take you and put you in bondage, to sell you as chattel. You are money. That's all they're thinking about. The name of the game is money. They're not concerned about whether or not you be black, white, or indifferent. It's just the idea that because you are the easiest one to capture, and they felt that you had no kind of religious order, no kind of thought, or no God, that you served no God. Remember, in Europe, the first thing they thought when they saw black people in Africa, they thought you had one eye, that you ate your children, that you had one big foot and one small foot. So their idea of you was something that was just way out of the way. Those who resisted were cut down immediately. They had the women screaming, the children screaming. This was 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. They always came early in the morning when they would roust you. Once you were rousted out, they would round you up, whole villages. Those who were killed with heads were smashed. That was a common way that slavers did. The children who were hanging on to their mothers usually cried and screamed. Those that were suckling their mothers were sometimes snatched from their mother's arms. In the event that the children would scream and holler, sometimes they would be killed on the spot. Coming down out of the mountains, they had yokes around their neck. They also had chains. They had ropes that were tied together. Those who could not keep up were killed. Children who went along, 3 and 4 years old, holding onto their mothers, when inadvertently little legs would give out. And when they fell, the slaves would take the gun butts and smash their heads. When you headed down to the ships, there were people who were sick and tired. And when they got sick and tired, sometimes they would fall down. When they would fall down, to keep from using bullets, the slaves would take a knife and open their stomachs, tie them to a tree, and let the marauding animals eat them. They were always, let me tell you one thing, when it was 2,500 in a village or 3,000 in a village, a lot of times 1,500 or less would get to the coast. The coast was usually 150 miles away. When they got down to the ships, or got down to the areas where they were supposed to be boarding ships, sometimes the ships wouldn't be there. They had to put them in holding pens in these castles. When they put them in these holding pens, they could use them however they wanted. But the day came when the ships came, and there they had to do what? They had to decide who was going where, who was going to do what. And what happened was once you were sold, they had to put brands on it. These branding irons were used. This particular one was from one of the Englishmen. This was from Spain. This is used in the Americas. This is used in the Americas to put on a face of a runaway slave to show that R shows that you're a runaway here and here. When the slaves would be put on board these ships, they would pack them. They would hobble them. They would take and pull their legs up in their chests after they were chained, and would put them in 5 across. 5 across, 10 to 15 up. You have 100 up on each side, and then you built decks. What you did, you had shelves. These shelves are built so that when you put 100 under this side, 100 here, and 100 here, on both sides they would do it. That way you had 600 on a ship that only held 450. Also there would be 50 in the bow of the ship. That was women and children. Now, as these ships got underway, you must realize that the sanitary conditions on these ships were deplorable. The British men of war that hunted them down said that they could smell these ships for 5 miles. That's how bad it was on these ships. These ships were constituted something called a deck ship. These ships were fixed so that you couldn't get off and you couldn't get on. You couldn't live on. But remember one thing, they were capturing slaves. When they captured slaves, they had slaves that were from Angola. They were warring tribes, and when they sold these slaves into slavery, these people into slavery, they had warriors on board. So there was always insurrections on these ships. Always. These ships never got away from the dock peacefully. So blacks resisted their capture. And the untold story is that they were standing on a dock waiting on people to come and gather them up. That didn't happen. They fought hard. A lot of these ships never got out of the docks, never got away from the water, because what they did was, by having the chains on, they would take the chains and constantly bang on the bottom of the ship. They would bang on the bottom of the ship, and holes would come in the ship, and the ship would be leaking. You didn't know where the water was coming from because the slaves were sitting in it and laying in it and drowning themselves and taking your ship with you. And the slaves had decided that if we're going to be in slavery, then death be our destiny. We'll die here. When they get out past the breakwater, or out past what we call the 12-mile limit here, but they were about 100 to 200 or 300 miles away from land. They'd run into heavy water or waves coming over the bows of the ship, a storm. They'd run into a storm. And what they would do was, they would close the ports. The ports down the bottom, the windows, they would close the ports, there would be no air. Frothing at the mouth would immediately come into play. They were gasping for air. They told me, and I read in a ship's manual, how they were trying to come up through the grates, screaming and howling because they were frothing at the mouth. And I read in a ship's manual how they were trying to come up through the grates, screaming and howling because they were frothing at the mouth and they were dying. But what happened was, they would die, and when they would die, they would open the grates to let them out, to let some of them out, to relieve some of the pressure, but nothing could be done. Then when all this was over, they would go down and close and open the ports again. But meanwhile, a lot of these people had already died and had been dead for 2 or 3 days, if not more. So you being chained to a particular slave would happen so that this slave's arm would be coming off, because after a while, the body begins to not mortify, but come apart, because it's already set up to where it has to die. Once the heart stops, then the skin worms come alive. They begin to consume the body. The body begins to fall apart to its masses. So in the event I'm chained to this particular person, when they bring the slaves out, they pull body parts out. They were opening their ships and pulling body parts out. And remember one thing, that you couldn't go to the bathroom. There was no such thing. The sanitary conditions were deplorable, like I said in the beginning. What would happen, you could be sitting at any time in an inch to 1.5 inches to 3 inches of your own feces, and the feces there with you. You had the blood, the vomit, the urine, the dysentery. You had everything there. You had the bodies that were decomposing. Everything was there. And again, like I said, the British men of war said they could smell the ship for 5 miles because of the smell and the stench. Once they got these ships close to land, they began to throw overboard dead bodies, which brought sharks in close to the city, in close to land. Now there was one ship in South Carolina that dumped her dead overboard close to land. The bodies washed up on land. The people in the village or in the town complained about the stench of the dead bodies. There were men, women, and children's bodies, about 60 or 70 of them on the beach that had washed up. On board ship, I read in the ship's journal, written by one of the surgeons on the ships, who said that these poor wretches aboard this ship have no idea what awaits them in America in that kind of slavery. They will be clamoring to get back on this ship. As horrible as all this was, nothing compares to what awaits them in the Americas.
For those who survived the Middle Passage, they still had more horrors to face them. They now had to go on the auction block to be sold. Many families, it's hard to imagine that an entire family was able to survive intact with a mother, father, and children. However, families were still formed. Mothers who may have lost their children aboard ship were able to take the orphan children of maybe their sister mate. Fathers who had lost entire families became the father of new families. So no one was left alone. These children and parents bonded during that voyage. Following the voyage, they were given just a little time maybe to rest, because they had to be prepared for the auction block. They were cleaned up. Palm oil was put all over their bodies to make them look healthy. Their hair was shaved so that they would get rid of any, mites or anything that they may have. Then they would be put on the auction block. Every orifice of their body was checked. Their mouths were held open as they looked inside their mouths for, decay in their teeth. They would look in their ears. They were made to bend over. How humiliated that must have been for those slaves, particularly the women, because they were naked as they stood before these leering crowds of people. A child who was suckling at a mother's breast would be taken and just thrown into the crowd, given as a token because it was more of a nuisance to keep that child there. While this mother, who so dearly wanted to keep her children with her, had no choice. They were taken from her as she was sold away. A young wench, a girl maybe 14, 15 years old, would be considered quite valuable because of the number of children she could have over the years. And a young buck, a male about that same age, would also be considered highly valuable because of the many years of labor he had ahead of him. Somebody in this age group could go for maybe $500. Someone older, maybe a woman in her 50s or 40s, who was long past her childbearing age, would be sold perhaps as a cook to work in the home. She might go for maybe $350. A man that age could be a butler. Or they both could be sold as field hands, and they may go for maybe $200 or maybe less. Young children, depending on their age, could go for maybe $50, $75, $100 because they too had some years ahead of them. They just had to be trained. But you need to remember that these were human beings that had bounties put on them. They were sold away from their mother country. They're now sold away from families that they had bonded with. So there was no sanctuary for these people. And they were people, but they were not treated as people.
This is the way the slave shackles would work. The chain was unlocked. Once the chain was unlocked, taken apart, very ingenious, very elementary. The hand was put in. Once the hand was put in, locking device would commence. It's just like a puzzle, but very elementary. It's locked in like this. That's one side. This is the locking device. This locking device is the other handcuff. It goes on like this, fits in like this. There's a pin that goes in. This pin slides in like this. Once it's slid in, it's locked. You're then locked in. The whole concept of this is to fix it so the person could not get away. You notice how these are made. If you look at the side here, this is all handmade. And that will show you why there were so many keys that were made to so many different things. If you ever notice, a jailer had 50,000 keys on his side. These keys represented all these locks because they could not find the same key was not always put in the same lock. And by being hand forged and handmade, they're always different. So that was your differences then. These are middle passage shackles. These shackles were used in the middle passage. What would happen is, once they got going up the gangplank, what they would do was take these off. These went off. This bar would go across the front of the leg, around the front. This bar would be put in the back. It would look just like this, with the legs here. After the shackles were put on, remember one thing, because of this metal here, because of the sharpness of the metal, it would actually cut into the skin. And when it would cut into the skin, a lot of times when they would get to land or go down to inspect the slaves, under here you would see maggots. Maggots would be cleaning the wound. But it showed that infection was already there, the maggots were cleaning it, and the bone was actually protruding through on some slaves. When they would get to land, they would try to cover it over with different muds, different creams, different things to cover it over, yet they were already scarred. In order to keep from scarring them, what they did after that, they went to a rolled kind of shackle, which would bruise but wouldn't so much break the skin. They had a rolled shackle. That way they had chains. They could move freer. They could take the slaves out much freer and much faster. Here, in another segment, we have runaway shackles. These were used and put on. Here, in another segment, we have runaway shackles. These were used and put on slaves to know where they were and how they were working. And what they would do was, they would take and open this. Once this was opened, they put it around the leg or whatever it would fit on. Sometimes it fit around the neck to determine how small it was. Then it would be locked on. Once it's locked on, it happens that you'd walk around and it would make this noise. The dogs in turn would hear the stones on the inside or the little seeds that were on the inside, and they would finally track the slave that was running with this. This was a runaway shackle. In turn, the slaves would in their running, they would fill it with mud. When it would try to fill it with mud, it would fix it so the bees wouldn't move around. But after it dried out and turned to dust, they would begin to move around again, and the dog could track it clearly. Another restraint we have here. This particular thing is called a yoke. A limb was cut, it was cleaned, primarily to keep slaves together. What it would do, like this, goes around the neck. When it goes around the neck, around here, wire would be put, so you couldn't get your head out. This was also used as a means of execution. To execute a slave because he was trying to run away, this thing would be used to put the head of a slave here and then smash his head. That's what these things were used for. It's made of wood. It's just a regular branch, but this has been used over the years, and it was sent to us from Africa by one of the chiefs. We're looking at shackles again. We're looking at another kind of restraint and forms of punishment meted out to people and slaves in the Southlands. This particular piece was made by a slave for a slave. And if you can notice, on the inside there's leather. That was so that you would not damage your product or damage the thing that you were using. This particular thing was made for a slave that just came on the farm. It was put on like this. He was shackled in. Once it was on, if he moved, this ball you carried wherever you went. Also, he had another piece of apparatus that he wore around his neck. While this was on, he wore these at the same time. This is a 5 to 6 pound weight. Where the concept of iron balls came from, this is where it would come from. What it would do, it would hit him wherever it needed to in the privates to keep him from running away. This was another way of restraining a people that did not read restraining. They captured people out of their own lands, brought to America, and put in slavery. Again, we have a ball and chain. This is made of pure iron. What it is, it weighs about 50 pounds. This particular item was dug up in a sugar mill. If you notice, this piece is broken off or either cut. Someone either tried to get out of it or they broke their way out of it. But here it is. These are the particular kinds of things they used. Again, we have another restraint here. This particular one came from Africa. This goes around the neck, also around the hands. Around the hands and the neck. This is how it was worn. When it was worn like this, remember that the sharpness of the iron or the metal itself would always cut into the person's neck, or the one or the wearer of this particular apparatus. So they were not careful. They were not careful with whoever they had it on. But one thing about it, the marks around your neck would show, because these heavy items leaning on the collarbones also cut into the collarbones. Again, forms of punishment. This particular one, again, would be put on a slave and hooked to a ball. Only the ball would be bigger. The ball would be 100 pounds. And it would fix it so that the person could not move all night. They usually lock them under the house. They fix it so they train them like dogs so they wouldn't run away at night. Also we have here, we have this particular one. This is a chain that was used to bring the slaves from the market, or slave catchers would catch this. They would hook this around the slave's neck, then hook them to either the back of a horse or the wagon, whichever came first. If the slave catchers would catch you and put this around your neck, they would drag you behind a horse. You would have to hold this. You would have to hold this. In the event that you fell down, remember, you could lose your head. So what you would do was hold on to this tightly. Once you got back to the plantation, you'd be beaten, ears cut off, and things like that. You, in turn, would become a piece of meat to have things sold to teach other slaves not to try to run away.
Whippings were very commonplace. So much so that they actually passed a law that forbid a slave owner from whipping a slave more than 100 times. These whips here are examples of the kind of whips that were used on the plantations. This is a rawhide whip. And while this looks very flexible, they would soak the ends of these tails, as they are called, in brine or salt water. And they would become so hard, they would be like a razor's edge. And when they slashed through the slave's naked back, it would leave these huge marks that these slaves would carry for the rest of their lives. This is a cane that would be used the same way. And when whacked across a slave's back or face or any part of his body, would also leave horrible marks. Women weren't left out of this either. A well-to-do white mistress would get gifts at Christmas time or for her birthday, similar to this item here, a comb and brush set that she would have in her boudoir, with a nice mirror. But I bet you never saw this. This is considered a white mistress's hand whip. She would be given this as a gift. It would be highly polished and have her initials or her name monogrammed on it, attached to a heavy strap. While this strap may look harmless, it's pretty thick, similar to a belt. And trust me, it offers quite a sting.
Over the years, I've been collecting artifacts. As a matter of fact, I've been collecting little pencils like this. I've seen alligators on jars. I've seen alligator ashtrays, and I've seen them depicted with kids in it. And I was wondering why the children would be there. As a matter of fact, this particular pencil sharpener, this is a pencil sharpener or a pencil holder with a black head of a baby sitting out of its mouth. I didn't pay any attention. I have been collecting for quite a few years, and I have the posters and things like that about different things. And then one day I was down in Florida. I'd gone down with my wife, and I took a trip for myself off to the Wild Blue Yonder, going out to hunt artifacts. And in my quest to hunt artifacts, I came upon a pawn shop in Sanford, Florida. In the pawn shop was a gentleman who owned it. They went and got him and told him I was there and I wanted to buy some of the shackles he had hanging around the walls. I asked him, could I buy them? He said no. He didn't want to sell anything. He just wanted me to see it. Then we began to talk. And I asked him, I said, look, please let me buy something. I got to take something from here. He says, no. He says, I don't want to sell anything. He said, but I'm going to the back and I'll sit down. Meanwhile, he came out. And came back out and he began to talk to me. He said, he said, you probably don't know this. He said, but years ago, he said, my grandfather before he died, told me of the things they would do. He said he would go down. He said his grandfather said they would go down and they would take babies with them. I said, what do you mean babies? He says, well, let me tell you. He said the slaves with them. I said, what do you mean babies? He says, well, let me tell you. He said the slaves who had babies, they would steal the babies during the course of the day, sometimes when the mothers weren't washing. And I said, what do you mean babies? I said, you mean babies like 5 or 6 years old? He says, no. These babies, some would be infants, some would be a year old. He said some would be toddlers. He said they would grab these children and take them down to the swamp and leave them in pens like little chicken coops. They would go down there at night, take these babies and tie them up because they hunted the big bull alligators. These big bull alligators were not raised on farms. They were in the wild. These alligators would weigh 600, 700, 800 pounds. Those are the ones they wanted. They would skin them, make the wallets, get the meat, do different things with them. He said, but what they were doing was tie them up, put a rope around their neck and around their torso, around here, and tie it tight. He said, the baby, I said, well, what would the babies be doing? He said, well, my grandfather said they'd be screaming. He said, what would you do? He said, just let them scream. He said, what they would do, it would help them to chum the water. He said, when they would throw the babies in, tied to this rope, he said, in a matter of minutes, he said, the alligators were on them. He said the alligators would clamp his jaws on that child. As a matter of fact, once he clamped on him, he was really swallowed. You couldn't see anything but the rope. And we would pull the alligator in and tie his nose and hit him in the head with an axe, a pickaxe. He said we would then drag him to the shore. We'd drag him to the shore and leave him lay, and we would do it again, maybe 2 or 3 times a night. I said, so what do you mean? He said, well, yeah, they were taking these babies and killing them for alligator bait. I said, so all these things I've been collecting, all these things I've been collecting are really, really something that I can really talk about and say they're of a truth by what you say. He said, I'm telling you, he said, nobody wants to talk about it. He said, I'm only telling you because you're here. I may never hear from you again. He said, but these things actually depict the acts that they did to slave babies back in the Bayou country and down the south. They did this. They hunted alligators with these babies. That's why they call alligator bait.
The word nigger was created during slavery by oppressors of black people. The word was used to demean blacks by inferring that they were lazy, good-for-nothing, thieving individuals. They actually, even many years later during the Jim Crow era, created items using the N-word. Here you have niggerhead shrimp. Later on, they became a little bit more defined and called it Negro head shrimp. They also have here a can called nigger hair tobacco, which was just chewing tobacco or smoking tobacco. Today, many blacks use nigger as a term of endearment. Disrespect of self invites the same from others, especially when those being disrespected are willing to tolerate it. Know your history, lest we forget.
They have to track me down and produce Ain't No Nigga for him, which was his first hit.
Nigga in the street, nigga, we ain't gonna focus on how another nigga roll.
Here are some other items from the Jim Crow era. Here are a pair, just a box of nails, featuring a black man with his mouth gaped wide open. And these infamous twins, the Gold Dust twins, they sold detergents similar to a very popular detergent we would have today, showing these two little black babies who would come in and just twin babies that would just clean your house, sparkling clean. Here we have Gold Dust powder. You also have toys that were created for young white children. This is a dancing minstrel. While he's dancing, and it looks like a lot of fun, notice how his face looks. He's made to look like a devil. Children learned early on to loathe and disrespect blacks. I think it's important that we recognize the abolitionists that played such an important role in freeing slaves. Yes, it was white people that put black people into slavery, but it was also white people that got them out of slavery. We did not do it alone, and we could not have done it without the caring and compassionate whites who realized from the very beginning that slavery was wrong. And they realized that Africans were human beings that deserved to be treated as such. And as a consequence, many of them lost their lives, they lost their properties, they lost their fortunes, trying to do things that would free the slaves. One of the things I think is real important to also recognize is that many of the women whose husbands were slave owners talked to their husbands and made them realize that what they were doing was wrong. They would wear them down by telling them that they really wanted to make sure that these people were being taken care of properly, particularly the children. And many of them started selling off their slaves or freeing their slaves. The erosion of the black family is one of the vestiges of slavery that are still with us today. We in the black community need to bring our families back together. We women need to understand that a child deserves to have both a mother and a father. Women, allow and accept your man back into the home. And men, be worthy of being accepted back in the home.